Oh. Alright, sup motherfuckers? This is a podcast, alright? Today, we're gonna talk about some shit. What are we gonna talk about? We're gonna talk about neurotyping. What is neurotyping? Neurotyping is some shit Digi came up with, but don't worry, they're bad at explaining shit, and I can do it better. What's up? My name is Magica, formerly known as Magic Man, and these are our guests. Please introduce yourselves in whatever order you desire.
I guess I'll start because I'm at the top of our Discord voice chat list. I'm Snail. I'm typed as the new type. And hold on, I'm gonna turn my mic sensitivity.
Okay.
Okay. Hold on.
Don't worry, folks. It's
Okay,
all part of the show.
This should be better.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Snail. I'm a new type, and the neurotyping system very lateral, very impressionist. I don't know what else to say. I'm just living the life right now. So let's go to Jellies, or aka Canvas, aka whoever.
Fuck yeah. Yes? At least not right now. Alright. Sick. We also have, really quick, we have a special guest, an observer state in the United Nations. Their name is Boney, or Bunny, or Bomy, or Dummy, or any other variation thereof. They are clear-sighted, if I recall correctly, and they're pretty neat. Finally, take it away, Mall Sam Small Man.
I am small man, and my chest is beating. My heart is beating out of my chest. I would hope my chest is not beating out of my heart with excitement.
Alright, cool.
I'm on a
What's your
crazy
neurotype?
sugar high right now. I am ready to pour my heart out.
Alright, what's your neurotype? Introduce your neurotype also.
I am
What's
smack dab in the middle of Overseer, and I
Alright.
don't know for how long that will be or how long it has been, but I'm cool.
Alright, cool. And since I forgot to do this earlier, hi, I'm an aesthetician, and I will be your host for today because I gotta explain some shit to you. Now, class, I would like to ask, have all of you motherfuckers heard of neurotyping before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Right, now, let me ask
Theorized on it myself.
Right, now let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever actually given you, like, an adequate, decent explanation of how it really works in concrete terms?
I don't think that explanation exists.
Okay,
I've been explained to it
congratulations.
well, but never very concretely.
Alright, well, congratulations, today is your day. Now, I'm gonna say this. The point of this podcast isn't necessarily to be the most accurate thing in the universe. The point is to make this digestible and understandable for normal people who aren't constantly theorizing about nonsense all the time, okay? Instead of having our heads in the clouds about it, we're getting a basic, concrete term explanation of how it works, more or less. You can disagree, you can agree, whatever the case may be. If you already have your understanding, that's fine. This is for the motherfuckers who don't know or don't really feel they fully get it, okay? Now, before we begin, does anyone have any questions they want to ask just off the bat?
I feel like I messed up the audio sync thing, and it's gonna be a pain to edit.
That's okay. I'll just edit you in the way which I find most amusing. Okay.
What
Anyone
will
else?
you not be explaining?
What will I not be explaining? Okay. Alright. What will I not be explaining? I will not be explaining cheese typing. I will also not be explaining the Reddit or going to any of that nonsensical extraneous details because that's not really important to neurotyping itself. Okay? Cool.
Good.
If you guys want, a history of neurotyping, like on like the community level. I'm sure that can happen at some point in the future, but that's not for today. Okay. All right. Cool. Now let's get started. First of all, neurotyping is a chart. Okay. Now, visually, it's usually represented by a set of boxes, but it's very important to understand that that's not really what it is. It's not literally boxes. It's just a spectrum. It's two spectrums, okay? Now, on the spectrum, a lot of people have competing definitions of what these two spectrums really mean and how they manifest, okay? So I'm going to be explaining my personal perception of how these things work, okay? Now, one of these axes is the lexical to impressionist axes, and another one of these axes is the lateral to linear axes. Now, some people have a harder time understanding one or the other, but that's okay, because we're going to figure it out together, alright? Cool. Now, the first thing we have to establish, if you're going to be going off of my understanding of the chart, is that laterality and linearity, and similarly, lexicalism and impressionism, are not fixed traits, they are functions that you use, okay? And in that way, it is your tendency towards certain functions that determines what we would consider your quote-unquote neurotype. So that doesn't mean, for example, if you're an aesthetician, you can't think lexically, and that doesn't mean if you're someone who's lexical, you can't think impressionist. It just means that if you are on that, you much prefer to be in that mode of thought than any other, okay? Now, what do these terms actually mean, practically? Well, let's get to it. So the first thing I'm gonna explain is lexicalism versus impressionism. Now, my definition may not jive with a lot of other people's. That's fine, but all I care about right now is getting an internally consistent, fairly simple explanation. So, lexicalism versus impressionism. To me, I tend to interpret this as the difference between the preference for an external framework or system of understanding versus an internal one, okay? Think about the difference between the world around you and the world that exists inside your noggin, okay? If you're someone who is more lexical, you are someone who, in order to know things, you source them externally, okay? For example, if you want to know something about math, you wouldn't think about math yourself and do this whole thing. You'd go and you'd find the person who knows about math, and you'd source them as your source of knowledge. And it is very important to you that your knowledge is consistent with whatever this is, okay? On the flip side, if you're someone who's more impressionist, you tend to delve inwards for these sorts of things, okay? So if we have two people who are both interested in, say, geometry, well, the lexical geometrist, let's coin that term, that person will get a bunch of books and study geometry and really try to get to know it on the really, how do we do this and that kind of thing level, okay? Whereas someone who is more impressionist might learn a couple things about geometry, sure, but then they'll, instead of going out and finding a bunch of books and do this, they'll just think about it. And they'll think about it and they'll try and contextualize it in terms of both their life and how it relates to this and how it relates to that. And the important point to remember here is that this is using your internal world as your source of truth and your source of reality. This is the lens through which you analyze and process reality, either through an internal lens or an external lens. Now, one thing we should specify is that this is not a dichotomy, this is a spectrum, okay? And not only is it a spectrum, it's a spectrum of functioning. What does that mean? Well, in this case, what it really comes down to is that, here, give me a second. Okay. What it comes down to is that the reason it might seem that these two things would be at odds. And that is sort of true, but it's important to understand that every external framework, every established convention or established lexicon originally began as some individual's internal framework, and vice versa, where an internal framework is often a reaction to the framework around you, okay? Now, as you can see, this kind of illustrates a difference in whether you rely more on the world around you as your source of reality or your own internal world as your source of reality. And of course, this also is there's also a lot of people who exist in between these two things. So people who are in the blue or purple column, you'll often find they, especially the highlights, will have a really hard time placing themselves and understanding themselves within this context of neurotyping, and a lot of them even struggle with their own identity and who they think they are. And that's because, in this case, when you exist, especially at the exact 50% point, in between as a person, you're processing, when it exists exactly in between your internal and your external worlds, well, the world around you and the world inside of you are very rarely in sync. They're very rarely perfectly reflective of each other. And when that's the case, it can be hard to determine who you really are when your internal world is contradicting your external world, but you rely on both of them equally to inform your reality. So, that is what, to me, lexicalism and impressionism is. And through this also is how we can explain chart looping. Because in this case, the idea behind chart looping would be that for someone who who processes reality exclusively through their internal lens, let's say, for example, me, an aesthetician and quite an impressionistic one, that person would have a much easier time thinking in the opposite stereotypy of relying entirely on an external framework rather than trying to simulate the nuance of an exact mix, okay? So it would be a lot easier for that person to simply switch between pure externalism versus pure internalism than it would be for them to go, say, quick-witted and try and, like, have a strange mix, okay? Now, that's the lexicalism and impressionism. Do we have any questions, disagreements, points to be raised?
Well, it's also worth mentioning that due to the lexicality being based on like commonly understood understandings and like terms, they have a lot easier time communicating usually to like people who are on the same page with those terms. And then the impressionists,
Right.
they'll have to like probably use like metaphors and like similes to like really get to the essence of what they're experiencing in their internal world.
Right, and this is actually why. Because, as I stated previously, as a general principle, we can just imagine this as being perfectly true, is that it's very rare when someone's internal reality is perfectly in sync or reflective of an external framework. That very rarely happens, and when it does happen, I imagine those are the kinds of people we consider like incredibly talented, where their internal world just already matches something that already exists, so they could just take to it like water, like fish to water. So, Small Man, do you have any questions?
It's perhaps a question or perhaps an addition. I don't know where it's gonna go, but
Okay.
One theory of language is that it is built to, it is kind of built for thinking rather than for communicating. But
Right.
Language gives like definition to thoughts, and
Right.
where it's not logical, it is a lexeme. So
Okay.
language is kind of out of the is a little bit out of is it a little bit out of the question on the lexicality versus impressionist scale, because on one end it is there as an external structure to give structure to thought, and on the other hand it develops essentially from your internal world.
Well, here's the thing, okay, is that, well, yes, language as like a broader system does exist outside of you, it exists exempt from you. Every person has an idiosyncratic way of using language because they process language in a particular way. Someone who's more lexical, right, they will rely on language to power thought. And that doesn't mean necessarily literally like spoken language. That could also mean like a visual language, okay? Or an auditory language, but obviously non-verbal. it doesn't necessarily mean words specifically. It just means tying specific meanings to specific pieces of information that can be seen as some sort of tangible, whether it be written down on a piece of paper or spoken out loud, okay? Whereas someone who's more impressionist, obviously they will have to use some sort of language to communicate with other people. However, rather than relying on language in the sense that they want to use the word the right way and use it to represent the correct idea, someone who's more impressionist would not necessarily have that approach. Rather, they would warp that system to fit their internal reality. And that's where things like metaphors and similes come in. That is not a function of them warping their thoughts to this language. That is a function of them warping the language to their thoughts. And again, we can see that one of them is relying on this externalist sort of reliance on an outer system, and the other one is using their internal system to manipulate this outer system. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so this solidifies the tendency towards usage thing. You give two different people the same tool, and they'll be able to use it in a different way based on their tendency of usage.
Exactly. Okay. Now that's lexicalism and impressionism. And to me, that is the one I figured out way earlier. I figured that thing out months and months and months and months ago. That was probably the simplest one. Now, the tricky part. Laterality versus linearity. And this is where I think it gets interesting, because it was very tricky for me to actually think about this. I found it very difficult to figure out how this works, okay? But then I sat down and I tried even harder. And I was like, well, let's think about this a different way. Because the way I approach lexicality versus impressionism is, why is there that tension there, right? What is it that separates these two things? Because one theory I've heard is that they both use the same kind of thought, it's just the approach. And that's kind of what I said too, in a sense. But, I'm not quite lateral enough to keep track of all these data points. But for me, that is assuming that they are traits. That is assuming that they are something inherent to who you are as a person, rather than a tool, something you interact with on its own terms. So, for that, I had to ask myself, what exactly causes this tension? And eventually the answer became clear to me, that it's a matter of internal versus external truth. Now, rather than thinking about what is the conflict between laterality and linearity, I instead thought, I flipped the script. I turned it around. And I asked myself, what is the harmony? What makes these things work together rather than work against each other? And that is where I found my answer. Because, you see, laterality and linearity actually do kind of correspond to particular concepts. For laterality, that would be complication, and for linearity, that would be consolidation. Now, I will also preface this by saying I'm fairly certain this idea has been stumbled upon. I'm pretty sure Timecake has described it. I don't know if they subscribe to it, but I'm fairly certain they've stated this, and I'm sure some other people have too. However, that's all buried in a bunch of Reddit stuff. And this isn't. So here we go. For laterality, I describe it as complication. What do I mean by that? Well, in this case, let's say we have a particular idea, okay? Let's say we have a particular nugget of an idea. It could be a question, it could be a concept, it could even just be a color. Who knows, right? If you're someone who's more lateral, your tendency will tend to go, okay, that's interesting. Let's dissect this. How does this work? And you tear it apart. And it complicates. Because now instead of having the one concept, you have these two related concepts, okay? Then you go, okay, but what do those mean? And you cut those in half. And those dissect further. And they dissect further. And they dissect further, okay? If you want a visual metaphor, imagine a bean plant. If you ever had a bean plant, I grew one before for school. They tend to have a lot of long, really wiry roots that go all over the place, okay? Because they don't really have, because what they're mostly worried about is they're worried about getting nutrients, okay? And similarly, if you're someone who tends to complicate your ideas rather than consolidate, you're someone who tends to dissect over and over and over again, you want to get the maximum amount of nutrients, quote unquote, out of this idea as you can, okay? Now, what is linearity? Well, this is the flip side of it, okay? Linearity I describe as consolidation. Now, what do I mean by that? Very simple. Let's say the linear person encounters two different ideas, okay? Maybe they're even related, who knows? Well, the linear person sees these two things, and they go, okay, that's interesting, but what does it mean? And so they take these two ideas and they consolidate them rather than take them apart. And in doing so, maybe they'll cut the chaff of some details, but they're going to get right to the heart of the idea, or right to the heart of what they're trying to get at. And they'll just keep going with that. So they'll consolidate maybe that with something else, right? So, for example, perhaps a linear person would go, okay, well, if A and B, that means C, right? Okay. And then get rid of A and B. Now we have C. Okay. Oh, there's D. Well, D and C, that equals E. Okay. And so on and so forth. So, as you can see, most people don't do one of these things exclusively. Most people do a mix, and that's why most people aren't perfectly lateral or perfectly linear, right? And so, when you combine these two axes, the axes of laterality and linearity, complication and consolidation, with the axes of internal versus external truth, we get neurotyping. Now, do we have any questions?
Fuck.
Any further comments or questions?
Well,
Can I
okay,
get
so what's the plan next? Like, are we gonna talk about the individual types, or like?
Well, if you guys had any questions, I would answer them, and then I would open the floor to if you guys have any ideas of your own about this, or if you have any problems with my explanation. Yes.
In your definition, laterality is to the tendency towards complication, like
Yes.
many pieces of information, or like dividing up pieces of information, or creating
Right.
new ones,
Yes.
versus consolidation, or like coalescing all the information into one point.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And also, this also ties into what I said earlier, where I don't think these are fixed traits that you have forever. I think these are functions that you use. And the tendency towards certain functions is what your neurotype really is. That's also where heat mapping comes in. Because, obviously, you don't think exactly the same way, exactly all the time, for exactly all the different situations. And that's not how people work. People aren't anime characters. We're a lot more three-dimensional than that. And also, in this same vein, Urquhart pointed out to me that in this way, if we accept this definition of laterality versus linearity, then not only does chart looping side to side become reasonable, as I explained earlier, then also chart looping up or down doesn't become impossible either. Because, after all, you can't complicate things forever. Or, well, I guess you could if you really wanted to, but most people can't. You see what I'm saying?
I'm following.
Right. And like I stated earlier, it's easier to imagine the extremes of a spectrum than the in-between, right?
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Exactly. So, yeah. And so that's where chart looping really comes in. Now,
like I'm a new type, but yeah, I often like loop to pure instinct when when playing an action game,
right.
or like if I get in the zone, then like I just like it's just like I kind of like go from like the like looking at huge like webs of information as like a huge impressionistic whole.
Hmm.
But then like kind of like and then that kind of like goes on the back burner, and then like the fire that comes out of it is like what drives me, and then I become pure instinct.
Right. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. That is also, coincidentally and funnily enough, why masturbating is a very linear activity.
I would disagree in my case.
Okay, all right. I'll take your word for it, man. All right. Anyway.
Sex is linear. Masturbation is not.
Well, I imagine it depends. Depends on your particular persuasion, I suppose. Are sex toys more lateral than not? Questions for next time. Anyways. So yeah, that is that is pretty much my explanation. Thoughts?
Oh, I've got a question.
Yeah.
What's your question?
The interaction between the two spectrums, like, obviously you describe the two spectrums. Obviously you can fall into a place on the two on each spectrum, but
Right.
is there any particular let's say synthesis of the two that's notable in terms of thought?
Oh, well, there is another thing I could get into. Something that, well, we haven't heard this name in a long time. Fellas, I think we're about to get into zone theory. Alright. Thank you, that was perfect.
Whoa.
Alright, I know. Alright, so zone theory. If you don't know what zone theory is, I made a video a long time ago where I had an incomplete like alpha version of it. So this will be the real version of it as far as I'm concerned, what I'm going to describe to you now. Now zone theory is the idea of, instead of thinking about the chart in terms of pure theory and numbers and how these two spectrums collide and da-da-da-da-da-da, instead of thinking about it in those kinds of terms of like pure theory, how does it really manifest in the real world? How does this manifest in reality, right? How does this manifest in the interactions between people? How does this manifest in structure? And so on and so forth. And that's where the zone theory comes in. So, I'm going to answer a question that is not being asked right now, but has been asked to me by an individual called Rio. Rio is the person who I initially gave this explanation to, and they had a very fun question that I'm sure the small man will absolutely appreciate. Rio's question was, so why does everyone hate overseers? And luckily for us, zone theory has the answers. I know, but don't worry, I can explain why. I can explain why they're that way. Bunny. If for the beautiful audience at home, Bunny just said it's because they're cunts. I agree, but don't worry. We'll get to it. So,
even I hate
theory,
overseers.
I know, don't worry.
Most overseers also hate each other, just
exactly.
personality-wise.
Well, I personally think that overseas are hot, so...
Right, well, it depends.
Asuka is my waifu.
Right.
We're done.
A lot of people cannot appreciate the salty taste of many overseers, okay? But anyways, zone theory. Now, on the chart we have rows and we have columns. And while we have... Digi explained their kind of vibe of each one, and I've explained the more concrete terms how they exist. Now we examine how these rows and columns interact with each other, okay? So, on each row, right, we have our different layers of linearity and laterality, okay? Now originally, when I did zone theory, I described it as such. On the bottom layer, you have, in the most non-pejorative way I could say this, normies, normal people. Think about the level-headed, the clear-sighted, the pure instinct, and the bookkeeper. These are fairly regular individuals. And the way they think is, generally speaking, is doesn't need to be complicated, and they don't like things being super complicated. For them, it's more... Think about... Have you ever seen the boomer meme? These goddamn millennials, I just want to fucking grill. That's linearity, boys. They're just chilling. They're chilling, dude. And they're cool with that. And if you want them to do something, okay, sure. Yeah. And that's the linear column, okay?
Just
and then above the linear... Huh?
Just to be clear, chillin' dude is not a linear person.
Unfortunately. That would be way funnier if he is. Now, the next layer up, we have what I termed the people who deal with people, okay? These are contemplative, understanding, externalist, and impressionist. And now, originally, I simply had a vague impression of what this was. So when I originally described it, I used examples of understanding and externalist. People who specifically were described by Digi as, for the externalist, someone who draws people in with their energy, okay? And with the understanding, people who can comfort people and show, through merely existing, that don't worry, you can be a little weird, it's fine. But that doesn't actually explain their function. Hey, we're getting back to function. Okay, the function of this row isn't merely to quote-unquote deal with people. It is translation, okay? Because these people can't... If someone who's super linear tries to explain something to someone who's very lateral, the lateral person might find their explanation lacking. Not because it's necessarily bad, but because it doesn't carry all the information they want it to, okay? Now, the person who's the understanding, or the externalist, or the impressionist, or the contemplative, will take that that simpler, lower explanation, elaborate on it, and pass it upwards, and to which it will then be digested and understood. And similarly, the people who are aestheticians, technicians, quick-witteds, and overseers, their ideas will get passed down, translated and simplified into the core heart of what really matters, and passed down to the most linear row, okay? Now, the second to most lateral column is one that I still have somewhat of a hard time really putting my finger on, but I think me and Rio came to something of a conclusion, in that if we think about it, we see a sort of checkerboard going on, where we have technicians and overseers who are people who are more try to be in the background, right? Think of the technician. What's the technician doing? The technician is someone who's dealing with all these different points of data, and they have to sort of make sure that everything fits together in this big, complex web of things, okay? And that kind of person doesn't need to be bothered all the time. They have something they're trying to do, okay? And overseers famously are very shy, also in the background a lot. Conversely, people who are quick-witted and people who are aestheticians, their well, not personalities, but their thought processes tend to be fairly loud, so to speak. They have what they think, and you will know what they think. And so, with this in mind, I remembered a particular detail that Digi mentioned about the quick-witteds, and that he said, well, many people will find them funny. The perceived cleverness of the quick-witted is relative to their audience. Huh, what does that mean? Well, very simple, actually. Quick-witteds are not universally funny. Holy shit, I know, it's crazy. I know Axie likes to spread propaganda about this, but it's actually true. Quick-witteds are funny to specific people, depending on the quick-witted, and depending on who they're trying to be funny to.
Absolutely.
Or anything else, really. It doesn't necessarily just need to be... Yeah, it doesn't just need to be funny. And so, and similarly, aestheticians, you're either really into what they have to say, and you're really down with their ideas, or you're not. You don't agree. And so, what does this make this poem? Well, if we take it apart and we look at all the things, what do these things have in common? These are the people who are the easiest to brush off. Exactly. Now, that doesn't mean they're hated necessarily. That just means they're the easiest to not think about too hard, or to disregard. If you don't find the quick-witted funny, you're just going to think they're an asshole, or you're just going to think they're an idiot. If you don't find the aesthetician's aesthetic pleasing, you're just gonna think they're a bitch. If and so on and so forth. Now, where this comes to with overseers, we'll get there. And finally, at the very top, we have the most. Yeah, we'll get there. Don't worry, we'll get there. We'll get there. We're almost there. We're almost there. Don't that like I already know it sounds like you rolled a 1. Don't worry, we got 2 dice. You're getting 2 ones. Snake eyes, motherfucker. All right, now the final top row is the highlights row. This is where you get your human calcs, your analysts, your
Wait.
fascinators, and your new types. Yes.
That's me.
May I interject perhaps a simpler terminology for the third row from the bottom?
Sure. Do you have some terminology you would like to interject with?
Let's use a metaphor here. You could say that they're all sort of collectors. Always, they're always either, like you said, with the technician and the overseer, they're always trying to get shit together. Overseers are a little bit more internal with that.
Okay.
And as with the quick-witteds and the aestheticians, they constantly take whatever's thrown at them and tack onto it or add it to whatever they're spouting at the moment.
Right.
These are people that take whatever event, idea, person, memory, and whatever is happening, and they just add it to whatever is happening in their mind. Add it to the thoughts, whether it be internally or externally.
Right. I actually agree with that. That was fairly astute. Good job, small man. Now, finally, we're at the highlight row, like I said, new types to human calcs. Now, this row is the row that is so markedly different in thought pattern to the majority of people who exist below the top lat zone that they are functionally unignorable. Where it's easier to brush off a quick-witted, you can't really ignore an analyst that same way. Or you can't really ignore a human calc that same way because just by existing, they draw attention to themselves. Because they're so divergent. Like I said before, it's a lot easier to think about the extremes of a spectrum than the nuanced middle bits. And what do these people represent but the extreme end of laterality? And in this way, you can see that, like, if you're someone who's a Smash player in the audience, there's an individual named Mewtwo King. Mewtwo King is a very famous Smash player. He was in the Forbes, if I recall correctly, at some point. And he is a human calculator. The most calculating of them all, in fact. And he was, for a time, my favorite idle Smash player. And I'm sure for a lot of other people, too. And that's because it's impossible to ignore his calculating nature. And similarly, it's impossible to ignore the Fascinator, unless they want you to. Think about Charles Manson. Okay, Charles Manson is someone whose mere presence is so magnetic that he managed to convince an entire group of people to kill a bunch of Hollywood actors in their home in broad daylight, and so on and so forth. And that will also bring us to the columns. What do the columns mean? Well, for the purple column, these are people who elicit strong emotional reactions from others. Strong reactions from others. If you're externalist, you elicit a strong magnetism, right? You draw people in. If you're someone who's an overseer, you repel, unfortunately. You do the opposite. And if you are the neurotype who... and this is because of the interaction between the row and the column. The row dictates that you are the easiest to brush off. The column dictates that you exhibit the strongest emotional reaction from other people. And therefore, you are the easiest to hate if you are an overseer, because you're the easiest to brush off and exhibit the strongest emotional reaction out of others. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Exactly.
People have that can explain some things.
It's unfortunate, but I do believe that it is some kind of accurate. Now, how do the other columns shake out? Well, For this, we're gonna need to get a little esoteric. I know. I didn't want to either. Unfortunately, my understanding of the columns is not as developed as my understanding of the rows. As much as I would like it to be, I haven't found the right question to ask to unlock it the same way I did for laterality and linearity. However, I do have a metaphor. I think it's a decent metaphor. So, if we think of all the columns as the pieces necessary to play a song, okay, the first piece, all the way on this side, the red column, is the player. Then the purple is the amplifier, the blue is the audience, and the green would be, I suppose, like the I don't want to say the music theorists because that feels reductive.
The recording?
But, yeah, actually, that would be a good one. The recording. There we go. They're the recording. Okay. And so it actually shakes out with what I stated earlier, where every internal reality is a reaction to an external reality, and every external reality or framework originated as someone's internal reality. So, similarly, someone plays a guitar, and that is recorded, and then that recording is heard by other people, who then go on to play guitar. See what I'm saying? And it's a flow from one end to the other. And then it loops back around. Oh, chart looping. Oh shit, there it is. It's happening. Oh no. And so altogether, that is Zone Theory version beta. Better than the original. Still not totally complete, but better than the original. Any questions?
Digi's original video on the subject was very column focused. I'm sure you could pull some column descriptors from there to improve on it.
That is true. I should do that. Snail, do you have any questions or thoughts or concerns?
So like the red column, they're like living it, and they're like they're expressing the thoughts with the way they live and function. But and then the green one is like the thoughts themselves that went out into reality that the red impressionists absorbed, and then started like kind of there's a fire inside them, kind of like just burns it, and then like the smoke is like their output's reality. It's like because it's like a I don't know where I was going with that metaphor, but like it's like the
new types, ladies and gentlemen, a new type.
Yeah, that's kind of tragic, man. Like
So,
I have such
take-
intricate thoughts, but then like I just really it's like hard to actually.
Yeah. What if you had nothing but incredibly intricate, detailed thoughts and no way to communicate them?
Sadly, my reality.
I know. Don't worry, Snail. It's a tragedy that many impressionists live together. That's actually a good joke, Dragon. If you don't know...
Anyways, Smallman's saying something.
Huh? Oh, okay, sorry. Go, Smallman.
I've gone from saying it to thinking it.
We'll say it now.
Impossible.
Just do it.
Alright. Let's see if I can get just speaking without thinking going, but
Okay.
you can take Bruce Lee, an impressionist,
Mm-hmm.
who is kind of birthing his internal reality into this world,
Right.
and you move it left
Yes.
into externalism, where he is a very striking figure. You can take this as he moves across towards the left of the spectrum, he
Mhm.
moves into your minds until he's on the screen in
Yes,
the movie.
Sure. Yes.
That made no fucking sense.
So, that's okay. You're both high Latin impressionists. It is understandable. Unfortunately, that is the consequence of highly internal reality combined with high complication levels in your thoughts. Also, finally, just to close this out, hold on, how long have we been going? Let me check.
We are 44 minutes in.
45 minutes.
44 minutes. All right. So to close this out, I'm going to close this out now. To close this out, I'm going to say that, and this is an address to the neurotyping community, that I have found it very frustrating the way in which this discourse has been undertaken. Because I like theory. Theory's neat. I do theory all the time. A lot of what we talked about was theory. However, my problem with theory is that we don't live in theory, we live in reality. And if you actually want people to understand the chart, or use the chart, or want to take the chart seriously at all, you need to explain how it works in reality, how it really shakes out with people, okay? If you have someone who doesn't have a context for neurotyping or isn't already a digifan, and you just go, oh yeah, lexicalism, impressionism, laterality, linearity, you've not actually told them anything, because those words don't mean anything to them, okay? All you said is nothing to them, and they were just going to write it off because it sounds weird and dumb. If you want people to give a shit about this thing, you have to give them a reason to, okay? That is why I have been thinking about how this actually happens in reality, how this shakes out, how it applies to the real world, and how you could actually go about placing yourself in it. And I also find it frustrating because I feel like a lot of people are misunderstanding the chart to a certain degree, and not in the sense that, oh, they think about it wrong, but in the sense that they approach, in the sense that they approach explaining it wrong-headedly, and I think they approach understanding it wrong-headedly. Because the impression I get, because I am an impressionist, or an aesthetician, which is an impressionist, the impression I get from a lot of the explanations I've seen is that people have only been thinking about it in terms of themselves. Or at least the people who have been the loudest about it have only really been thinking about it in terms of themselves. And my problem with that is that neurotyping isn't for you. It's so you can contextualize yourself within the context of the people around you. It's not just supposed to be exclusively your thing. It's a thing to help you understand everybody. But
wait,
if you don't understand
there are people
the
who
thing,
don't approach it that way.
I know there are people who don't approach it that way, and that's fucking beautiful.
What?
Yeah, and fucking, I think
That's why I get in so many fucking arguments.
exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Is the chart isn't for you; it's for everyone in that sense. Okay. And the problem is that if you only think about it in terms of it being for you, then you only care if it's understandable to you. And if you want people to engage with the idea, then it needs to be understandable to them too. And this is where I think the real tragedy comes in. Because to me, I see this as the complete breakdown of communication. Okay, I think Led Zeppelin had a song they stole about this. Because to me, the best way to not only process things, but also to go about sharing things is chart looping. Because again, these aren't traits, they're functions. And you can use pure lexicalism or pure impressionism if you're someone like me, or someone like EGAG, or someone like Snail, or whatever else, if you're willing to go for it. Because, and the reason you should do this, I think you should do this, is because when you're only talking in terms of yourself, no one can understand you. And if you're only talking in terms of real reality, no one cares. Because they're not connecting with their reality. You need to marry lexicalism and impressionism. You need to balance them. And you need to do so in such a way that you don't lose sight of who you are and in the process, which I feel is the struggle that a lot of people, like I said before, in the perfectly middle in between impressionism and lexicalism in the purple-blue column. I feel like that's their struggle a lot of the time. And so, because of this, we've had a lot of people who are purely lexical or trying to communicate in a purely lexical way, and that's going over motherfuckers' heads because it's all theory and it doesn't mean anything to them. And on the flip side, you've had people trying to explain it in hyper-impressionist terms, and it goes over people's head because it doesn't mean anything to them because they don't even know what you're trying to make a metaphor for. And as you can imagine, if no one understands what we're talking about, then we're, as far as anyone's concerned, we're not talking about anything that's important, right?
Yeah.
There we go. So that is why I made this fucking podcast. And that is why we have convened here.
Well, now that you've described it,
Yes.
let's come up with some ways that it's important.
Okay. Well, like I said before, I think it's mostly important as a way of means of understanding yourself in relation to other people. But of course, it is also a lot of fun to just sort of do it frivolously, just for random things, you know. Oh, neurotype this video game. Neurotype that video game. Neurotype this hot dog. Neurotype that t-shirt. That's a lot of fun.
We can extrapolate on the practical aspect of contextualizing things. So we can take a situation or like.
Well, here.
Did this in the original video?
Here, I'm gonna break this down really simply because I think this is the easiest point to make. Is that if you're someone who gets in disagreements with people and you don't understand why they're not getting it, for example, if you're someone who's very lexical, you don't understand why these dipshits are insisting on this or that when it's not relevant to reality. Well, if you understand neurotyping and you understand that they're probably more impressionists than you are, then instead of trying to force lexicalism onto them, you can tailor your communication in a way that actually accommodates them and will let you be understood. Conversely, if you're someone who's hyper-impressionist, such as myself, then you can take on a lexical veneer, as I have done for this entire podcast, and you can make yourself understood to people who are lexical through that function. And it is...
How do I put on the lexical veneer?
Well, it takes practice, much like
You
anything
put on
else.
glasses.
Of course. For me, I found it easiest to absorb information and absorb it wholly. So, for example, something I tend to do quite often, and this is because I do have Asperger's, but I think it is something you could do if you wanted to, is I tend to read a lot of Wikipedia articles for hours and hours and hours and hours every single day.
Yes!
And I tend to read a lot of books, and I tend to read this, and I tend to read that. And in doing so, I have developed an understanding of how people tend to word things for them to be understood clearly. After all, if I'm reading this very lexical article on Wikipedia, and I'm very impressionist, I'm understanding it perfectly, then logic dictates that if I communicate in that way, I will also be understood, right?
Oh yeah, like that. I kind of did that because like I took the Wittgenstein quote, "Whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent," and I just do that whenever I can't explain anything as an excuse, you know.
Right. For me, I want to be understood. Not out of some sort of emotional need, but because, well, I guess it is an emotional need insofar as I find it very frustrating to talk to people, and I know what I know, and I know that I know it, but they don't know that I know it, and they just think I'm talking out of my ass, and that's very frustrating. Especially if I'm very impressionist, I rely on my internal reality, they're hard lexicals, they rely on their external reality, and we aren't accommodating each other, well, conflict does arise. Now, some other things you could do to train your lexicalism, I would suggest practice explaining things to yourself. That's what I do a lot. That's how I came up with all this shit. Is I will pace around my room and I'll talk to myself, and I'll talk to myself like there's someone else there. And if I can make my very complex points, and not complex as in smart, but complex as in there's a lot of moving parts, if I can make these points to myself in a way that I can comprehend, then I should be able to do it to someone else. And if I'm not understood when I do it, then I need to practice some more. Think about lexicalism as a function, and functions, to me, translate, not perfectly, but in a certain sense, as skills of sorts, okay? much like any skill, you need to practice them to be good at them. Much like playing the guitar, if you want to shred, you need to practice shredding. If you want to write a book, you need to practice writing. And if you want to communicate in a lexical way, you need to practice communicating in a lexical way. Now, granted, I am not as lateral as some people. I'm a very lateral aesthetician, but I am not a new type. I am not a fascinator, so I imagine I might have an easier time consolidating my thoughts than maybe Snail might, for example. However, I don't think it's impossible, because as I've stated previously, no one is perfectly lateral or perfectly linear. So, oh, and also, if you want to practice lexicalism, I think it's also important you practice consolidating your thoughts as well, because that is, I feel, a big part of why a lot of lexical people can be as well understood as they tend to be. Because they're not just good at communicating in a lexical fashion, they're good at consolidating what needs to be said into the relevant information. Now, what you judge as being relevant, that depends on the laterality here, of course, and obviously human calculators will split rather than compound, but when it comes time to communicate, they will understand that rather than share the entirety of the system to you, it is probably better to share what matters to you in that moment.
Alright, let's prevent some further
Beautiful.
rambling. And let's whip it back to where you said it's fun to do. There are plenty of people who do frivolous things with the neurotyping, such as just, oh, this person is that, and this person is that, and this person is that. And my favorite, the cheese chart, as you may. So, this has been extrapolated from the fact that the original video in which Digi debuted this subject was neurotyping anime characters. But, if we tie it to what you were saying, Digi was doing this with heavy context in terms of the series, as of course she has a lot of knowledge of where she pulled these characters from and why she pulled them from. So there is a.
Well, I think that's a very interesting case study.
Yes,
this is in especially the fascinator neurotype.
It's like
because Digi. Oh, sorry. Go.
Digi was performing media analysis, whereas most of this like cheese chart kind of business is prescriptivism or simple descriptivism.
Descriptivism.
Yeah.
Descriptivism.
If you're prescriptive with this, you're a douchebag.
Well, prescriptivism means that you believe that things should be a certain way, whereas descriptivism is you're just explaining how things are.
So, what I'm trying to say here is that we can do useful things with this chart when we're using it to analyze rather than to, as people on the spectrum, on this other spectrum, ASD, tend to do, simply collecting and sorting and, what's the word?
Complicating?
No.
No,
Basically, if you analyze rather than just fucking dump things into categories.
Synthesis.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think Digi's video is actually a very interesting case study. Because Digi came up with a concept, neurotyping. However, they aren't a naturally lexical thinker, even if they wanted to be at the time. So, what do? Well, he is very lateral. He tends to complicate his thought. And so, excuse me. And so, for him, he was like, okay, I need to consolidate this, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not a neurologist. I don't have the knowledge necessary to put this into concrete lexical terms. So what can we do here? And this is where it gets interesting. Because rather than simply say, hey, this is what's up, Or rather than simply go, oh, I kind of feel like this, what they did is they took something they did know about, which is anime. They took their area of expertise, and then they transliterated it onto this chart as a means of explaining the chart to the people who follow them. And I think that is a very interesting example of someone who used external reality as a tool to reflect something that they discovered through their internal system of truth. Right? Because like I said, they're not a psychologist. They're not a scientist. But they did state that this is something they noticed in how people act. So, there we go. I would actually encourage people to analyze that video, not just for neurotyping, but specifically for how Digi goes about approaching neurotyping. Because I think that could probably be very illuminative, both of how Digi approaches things and also where the chart is coming from, so to speak. However, that is beyond the scope of this podcast. So, I think we're fine.